Hello, my name is OMAR BARGHOUTI. I'm a co-founder of the Palestinian-led BDS Movement for Palestinian Rights. Today, I will talk about BDS, resisting Israel's apartheid while defending expressions of solidarity with Palestinian liberation. As Israel becomes a role model for far-right, xenophobic, authoritarian leaders across the world, from Trump and Salvini to Orban, from Bolsonaro and Modi to Mohammed bin Salman, it is intensifying its desperate attempts to demonize and criminalize solidarity with the Palestinian liberation struggle, and especially with the boycott, divestment and sanctions, or BDS movement for Palestinian rights. BDS, after all, is increasingly being recognized as a significant partner in a growing international progressive wave fighting for global, indigenous, racial, economic, gender, social, and climate justice against the forces of fascism, xenophobia, and savage neoliberalism that are Israel's best allies today. In the last few months, in a Global South response to a unified Palestinian civil society call for lawful targeted sanctions to stop Israel's apartheid regime and its planned de jure annexation of more of the occupied Palestinian territory, 7 former presidents of Latin American countries, 2 former presidents of South Africa, along with hundreds of public officials, parliamentarians, civil society leaders, academics, and others from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, have endorsed sanctions to stop Israel's annexation and apartheid. Similarly, the Senate of Chile, as well as the parliaments of Belgium and Netherlands, voted for sweeping sanctions against Israel if it went ahead with formal annexation. This response, spearheaded by the BDS movement, may help to explain why Israel's extremist government and its allies since 2013 have regarded BDS as a strategic threat to its entire regime of military occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid. It may also explain Israel's more recent detention and interrogation of Palestinian human rights defender and BDS coordinator Mahmoud Nawajah, who was released just very recently after a worldwide campaign of pressure on Israel. The impact of BDS campaigning at the municipal and political levels has figured prominently in a recently published Israeli anti-BDS report that bemoaned the movement's increased sophistication and admitted that despite Israel's massive investment of human and material resources against BDS, Israel has largely failed to disrupt the BDS momentum. The Palestinian-led BDS movement has an uphill battle ahead against an Israeli regime of injustice that is more fanatic and violent than ever, and more determined to complete the Zionist settler colonial project of erasure of the past, present, and even future of the indigenous people of Palestine, or what Edward Said once called the disappearing of the Palestinians, all in partnership with the Trump administration. Yet over the last 15 years since its launch, with the overwhelming support of Palestinians in historic Palestine, as well as in exile, BDS has changed the discourse on Palestine, on Israel's apartheid regime and its system of oppression, and most importantly, on the moral obligation to end complicity in this system of oppression through sanctions, as well as boycotts and divestments. This has made Palestine's South Africa moment closer. Israel and its supporters are overwhelmingly trying to suppress support for Palestinian rights and to ensure impunity for Israel's system of apartheid and colonial oppression. From its brutal siege of Gaza to its land-grabbing construction of illegal settlements and gradual ethnic cleansing, especially in occupied Jerusalem, the Jordan Valley, and the Naqab or Negev, Israel has for decades been perpetrating what UN investigators call war crimes or crimes against humanity. This is what the ongoing Palestinian Nakba looks like. Upon visiting the occupied Palestinian territory, in fact, the late ANC leader Ahmad Katrada, who was a supporter of BDS, said, quote, "In our short stay here, we have seen and heard enough to conclude that apartheid has been reborn here. In its reborn form, it is, however, worse, than its predecessor, end of quote. Regardless, most Palestinians remain hopeful despite all the pain and loss. As Professor Rashid Khalidi puts it, the ultimate goal of the Zionist settler colonial project in Palestine, the erasure of the indigenous Palestinian people, has failed. Aside from the Palestinian people's heroic sumud, or steadfastness, BDS today has become a major source of realistic hope for Palestinians. It has won the support of major international trade union federations, the largest farmers' union in India with 16 million members, progressive women's groups, academics, students, LGBT activists, grassroots movements all over the world, and others. In September 2015, Veolia, the French corporate giant, became the first international corporation to end all involvement in Israel's illegal projects after a 7-year campaign had cost Veolia billions and billions of dollars worth of contracts. This has triggered a domino effect, with telecommunications giant Orange and then Ireland's largest building materials company, CRH, also pulling out of Israel's economy in 2016. Bowing to BDS pressure, after suffering what the Financial Times called reputational damage, G4S, the world's largest private security company, also decided in 2016 to end most of its involvement in Israel's illegal business. G4S remains on top of the BDS world targets for boycott and divestment, of course, because it continues to be deeply complicit in training Israeli police, who are notorious for involvement in war crimes against Palestinians, especially in Jerusalem. The campaign against G4S was strongest in Jordan, Norway, Lebanon, the European Parliament, South Africa, Colombia, among others. In the first weeks of 2016, the Pension and Health Benefits Fund of the United Methodist Church, one of the largest and richest Protestant churches in the US, whose fund is worth over $20 billion, declared the 5 largest Israeli banks off limits for investment, and it decided to divest from the 2 that it held in its portfolios. The Presbyterian Church USA and several other, mainly Protestant denominations there, have also divested their pension funds from complicit corporations and banks. Mainstream churches in South Africa have also endorsed BDS. More recently, a massive Dutch pension fund, ABP, has divested from 2 Israeli banks, Leumi and Hapoalim, over concerns about human rights violations. The city of Dublin in 2018 became the first European capital to adopt BDS. Today, several members of the US Congress endorse BDS or defend the right to advocate for BDS to achieve Palestinian rights and call for leveraging, for conditioning US funding, military funding to Israel to hold it accountable to international law. Tens of cities and hundreds of cultural institutions and public spaces in the Spanish state, Italy, Belgium, Norway, Ireland, and elsewhere have declared themselves apartheid-free zones, calling for an arms embargo in Israel or excluding from public tenders corporations that are implicated in Israel's human rights violations. The AFZ campaign was launched in tens of Spanish, Catalan, and Basque cities. Begun in 2005 by the broadest coalition in Palestinian society, representing the overwhelming majority of Palestinians in historical Palestine, as well as in exile, BDS has become a key part of Palestinian popular resistance and the most effective form of international solidarity with our struggle as an indigenous people of Palestine for freedom, justice, and equality. BDS calls for ending Israel's 1967 occupation, ending its institutionalized and legalized system of racial domination and discrimination, which meets the UN definition of apartheid, and upholding the right of Palestinian refugees to return to the homes and lands from which they had been dispossessed, uprooted since the 1947-1948 en masse ethnic cleansing, or Nakba. These 3 basic rights correspond to the 3 main components of the Palestinian people. According to 2018 statistics estimate, Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, constitute 38% of the Palestinian people. Palestinian citizens of present-day Israel are 12%. Palestinians in exile are 50%. More than two-thirds of Palestinians are refugees or internally displaced persons. BDS is deeply rooted in decades of Palestinian popular nonviolent resistance to settler colonialism. It's inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, the US civil rights movement, and to an extent the Indian and Irish anti-colonial struggles. Together with the climate and gender justice movements, BDS belongs to an evolving modern paradigm of globalized intersectional solidarity and resistance to oppression. Global, strategic, intersectional, and mutual solidarity with struggles against oppression in all its forms has become more than ever an essential ingredient for building any strong local resistance movement. Based on its inclusive and progressive principles, BDS has established and nourished bonds of mutual solidarity with movements defending the rights of refugees, immigrants, blacks, women, workers, indigenous nations, LGBTQI communities, ethnic and religious minorities, etc. A growing number of anti-colonial Jewish Israelis support BDS and play a significant role in exposing Israel's regime of oppression. When the largest farmers' union in India that I had mentioned adopted BDS, it was motivated by a strong sense of internationalism, for sure, rooted in India's once historic role as a leading supporter of liberation movements, and just as strong commitment to resisting the corporate takeover of the Indian agricultural sector by Israeli, among other corporate criminals. Similarly, a 2015 Black for Palestine statement in the US, endorsing BDS, highlighted the call to boycott G4S, the world's largest security firm, due to its complicity in Israel's brutal oppression of Palestinians, for sure, but also because of its involvement in the private incarceration system in the US, which disproportionately targets young black and brown men. In 2016, the Palestinian BDS National Committee, the largest coalition that leads the global BDS movement, was among the first to unwaveringly stand in solidarity with the Standing Rock Sioux indigenous tribe in the US in their struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline Project, an oil pipeline project. The BNC statement said, quote, "The BNC supports the restoration of all lands guaranteed by treaty to the Standing Rock Sioux and all other indigenous nations. As indigenous Palestinians, we pledge to stand in solidarity with indigenous peoples around the world, including in Turtle Island, in their struggle for justice, self-determination, restoration of rights, and respect for their heritage." Intersectionality, a concept developed by Black feminist intellectuals in the US, is fast becoming an indispensable component of effective justice struggles of oppressed communities worldwide. To Palestinians and many other oppressed communities around the world, Black Lives Matter matters in a very profound way. Not only is the struggle for Black liberation inherently important to humanity in its own right, it's also organically intertwined with global struggles for freedom, justice, and equal rights, including our struggle. Other than being Israel's funder, defender, and partner in crime, the US establishment shares with Israel deep historical and ideological connections. Both settler colonial regimes are based on the perceived supremacy of the colonizers and the dehumanization of the colonized. Ironically, Israel's birth as a violent settler colony is now flaunted as a model for the far right around the world, including a leader of white supremacist movements in the US who called his racist notion of white nationalism, he called it, quote, "a sort of white Zionism." This unmistakable allusion to Israel's exclusionary foundations as a state that privileges Jewish settlers over the indigenous Palestinian population and that treats African asylum seekers as cancer further exposes the often obscured contradiction between Zionism and liberal ideals. As this contradiction becomes more visible, support for holding Israel to account is growing even among Jewish Americans and the broader US public, which is extremely important, of course, for us. Already in 2014, a survey by an Israel lobby group, J Street, showed that 46% of non-Orthodox Jewish American men under the age of 40 support a full boycott of Israel to end its occupation. When the settler colonial logic of elimination of the indigenous population, as was perpetrated to various degrees in the US, Canada, Australia, is not possible, the colonizers understand that for their project to thrive, they must subdue and eventually domesticate the indigenous colonized population, including by imposing isolation on it. South African Black consciousness leader Steve Biko once argued, quote, "The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed," end of quote. Indeed, as early as 1923, Zionist leader Ze'ev Jabotinsky wrote with lucid honesty, quote, "Every native population in the world resists colonists as long as it has the slightest hope of being able to rid itself of the danger of being colonized. Zionist colonization," he added, "must either stop or else proceed regardless of the native population, which means that it can proceed and develop only under the protection of a power that is independent of the native population, behind an iron wall which the native population cannot breach." Aside from its more recent concrete wall, Israel has incessantly been constructing an iron wall in our minds by trying to reduce us to lesser humans, or what I call relative humans, to isolate us from our natural Arab environment and the rest of the world, and to sear into our consciousness through sustained hegemonic violence the imperative of submission to its indomitable power as fate. The most important goal of colonizing the minds of the oppressed is to imprint in them the lethal futility of resisting ongoing colonization. Consequently, the struggle for Palestinian liberation has always been conditioned upon decolonizing our minds from the deeply seated powerlessness and hopelessness that may inhibit us, and embarking on a praxis, as Paulo Freire would say, a radical process of hopeful, globalized resistance, transformation, and emancipation. Despite decades of ruthless Israeli ethnic cleansing and settler colonial brutality, enabled mostly by the West, Palestinians have not given up. We continue to resist oppression and to assert our quest for emancipation, self-determination, and equal rights to all humans. BDS fights this hopelessness by providing a particularly potent form of rooted, anti-racist, intersectional, contemporary, and context-sensitive nonviolent resistance that is also strategically effective. The impact of the BDS movement has reached many fields, including the academic and cultural boycott spheres. I'll talk about the cultural boycott and then the academic boycott as two examples. Cultural boycott initiatives against Israel, which mostly come in response to 2004 call by the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, or PACB, and to the 2005 Palestinian Civil Society call for BDS, more often than not cite the boycott of apartheid South Africa as a key reference. This reference is neither coincidental nor rhetorical. It stems from the many similarities between the two cases of colonial oppression, and it aims to highlight the effectiveness and moral unassailability of using the boycott in the cultural sphere to resist a persistent oppressive order that enjoys impunity and ample complicity from the powers that be around the world, and to increase the isolation of oppressive regimes like Israel's. Despite its undisputed growth, the cultural boycott aspect of BDS has been among the most controversial, fiercely debated, aspects, and not just in relation to the South African reference. The most resilient objection to the cultural and academic boycott, the supposedly inherent contradiction between the boycott and freedom of expression and exchange, is in fact based on a wrong premise that Palestinians are calling for ostracizing individual Israeli artists, academics, and writers, which is absolutely false. PACB and the BDS movement at large never did. The 2004 PACB call, the guidelines for the international boycott of Israel, and all PACB documents and speeches on record have consistently called on international artists, academics, and institutions to observe a boycott of Israeli academic institutions, cultural institutions that are complicit in violating Palestinian rights, not individuals. Those who once endorsed or even struggled to implement the full blanket academic or cultural boycott against apartheid South Africa and are now hesitant to support a targeted institutional boycott of Israel are hard-pressed to explain the hypocrisy. One of the main objectives of the academic and cultural boycott of Israel is exposing the deep complicity of Israel's academic and cultural institutions in Israel's regime of oppression, thus revealing the true brand of Israel, if you will. The Israeli government launched its Brand Israel campaign in 2005, apparently in response to the 2004 PACB call and the initial traction that PACB had gained in the UK and beyond. This branding campaign focused on improving Israel's image abroad by, quote, downplaying religion and avoiding any discussion of the conflict with the Palestinians, end of quote, and by spinning it as relevant and modern. Upon the launch of this branding campaign, a former Deputy Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, Nissim bin Shetrit, said, quote, "We are seeing culture as a propaganda tool of the first rank, and I do not differentiate between hasbara or propaganda and culture." End of quote. After the Israeli war of aggression against Gaza in 2009, Israel's image took a further steep dip, prompting the government to throw more money into the Brand Israel campaign. A top Israeli foreign ministry official at the time told the New York Times, quote, "We will send our well-known novelists and writers overseas, theater companies, exhibits. This way you show Israel's prettier face." End of quote. An almost hidden secret of the Israeli government's Brand Israel effort is a contract that obliges Israeli artists and writers to get funding from the Israeli Foreign Ministry as service providers to conform to and indeed to promote state policies. It effectively buys the artists' and writers' consciences, making a mockery of the freedom of expression mantra. BDS fundamentally calls on people of conscience and their institutions to fulfill their profound moral obligation to desist from complicity in Israel's system of oppression against the Palestinian people. Artists and other cultural figures are no exception. Understanding this ethical obligation, the majority of celebrities, especially younger ones who do care about universal human rights, usually turn down very lucrative offers to play in Tel Aviv when they realize that no matter what their intentions may be, their performances in Tel Aviv will invariably be manipulated to whitewash by art or artwash Israel's regime of apartheid and military rule. The cultural boycott of Israel is growing steadily, with thousands of artists endorsing it. Earlier this year, more than 130, mostly LGBTQI filmmakers and film artists signed a pledge to boycott Tel Aviv Fest, Tel Aviv's famous LGBT film festival, in solidarity with the Palestinian LGBT community. In 2019, despite Israel's much-hyped propaganda around its hosting of the massive European Song Contest Eurovision, and expectations to attract up to 50,000 tourists flooding Tel Aviv, only some 5,000 tourists made the trip. The well-planned BDS campaign against Eurovision in apartheid Tel Aviv went viral at the time, attracting support from more than 150,000 Europeans and others who signed petitions for the boycott. Hundreds of leading artists also supported the boycott, including former Eurovision contestants and one winner. And over 100 LGBT organizations and centers joined the call. Even in Hollywood, following BDS appeals in 2016, none of the 26 Oscar nominees accepted junkets, gifts worth $55,000 apiece offered by the Israeli government. BDS partners in the US, like Jewish Voice for Peace, played a key role in this exceptionally successful campaign. Thousands of cultural figures in Montreal, Canada, Ireland, South Africa, the UK, and elsewhere have signed pledges in support of the cultural boycott of Israel. Already in 2010, a music industry insider warned that the winds could be shifting against Israel. He admitted that in a few months, he had approached more than 15 performing artists with proposals to give concerts in Israel, but none had agreed, he said, despite extreme big numbers offered for the artists as a fee. But what about the academic boycott? Academic associations and tens of student governments at Stanford, UCLA, Berkeley in the US, Canadian, UK universities, in Belgium, in Norway, in the Spanish state and elsewhere have voted in the last few years for various BDS measures, including divestment from companies involved in Israel's occupation. In parallel, many individual academics around the world have joined the widespread silent academic boycott of Israel, that is, the unannounced yet very effective shunning of academic visits to and relations with complicit Israeli universities. The complicity of Israeli universities takes many forms, from developing weapon systems and military doctrines used in the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity, to systematically providing the military intelligence establishment in Israel with indispensable research on archaeology, demography, geography, hydrology, psychology, among other disciplines, to tolerating and often rewarding racist speech, racist theories, and racist scientific research. This complicity also includes institutionalizing discrimination against Palestinian Arab citizens, among them scholars and students, suppressing Israeli academic research on Zionism and the Nakba, the forced dispossession of Palestinians, and the construction of campus facilities and dormitories, student housing, in the occupied Palestinian territory, as Hebrew University has done in East Jerusalem, for instance, which is a war crime. Technion, Israel's technical university, prides itself of developing many of the weapon systems, particularly drone technologies, which were employed by the Israeli forces, occupation forces, in their bloodbaths in Gaza. Tel Aviv University has not only designed tens of weapons used by the Israeli occupation forces, the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv also takes credit for the development of the so-called Dahiya doctrine, or the doctrine of disproportionate force, that is adopted by the Israeli army and which calls for, quote, the destruction of the national civilian infrastructure and intense suffering among the civilian population, end of quote, as means of defeating an otherwise impossible to defeat non-statal resistance. In what PACB describes as a new law, even by the already dismal Israeli academic institution's ethical standards, renowned Israeli academic Mordechai Kedar of Bar Ilan University urged raping the wives, sisters, and mothers of Palestinian militants to deter them. But what about academic freedom? The BDS movement upholds the universal right to academic freedom and therefore calls for an institutional, not an individual, boycott. PACB subscribes to the UN definition of academic freedom, which prohibits the infringement on the academic freedom of others, as well as discrimination and repression. Anchored in precepts of international law and universal human rights, PACB rejects on principle any McCarthyite-type political tests or boycotts of individuals based on their opinion or identity, such as citizenship, race, gender, religion. We reject all forms of discrimination and racism. If, however, an individual is representing the State of Israel or a complicit Israeli institution, such as a dean, rector, president of a university, or is commissioned, recruited to participate in Israel's rebrand effort, then her or his activities are subject to boycott because they become ambassadors of Israel, no longer individual academics or artists. Moreover, the boycott conflicts with academic freedom argument also confuses academic privileges with academic freedom and fails, accordingly, to grasp that an institutional academic boycott would harm perks and privileges, not rights. Another important factor behind the academic boycott of Israel is that Palestinians and Palestinian education have suffered for decades from Israel's repression of Palestinian education, or what some have termed scholasticide, which goes back to the 1948 Nakba. An Israeli researcher's dissertation, for instance, has found that Israel has deliberately stolen from Palestinian homes, schools, and libraries, especially in Jerusalem, Jaffa, Haifa, and Safad during the Nakba, tens of thousands of Palestinian books that it plundered and destroyed or kept those stolen books in Israeli libraries. In the first few weeks of the first Palestinian Intifada or uprising in 1987, Israel shut down all Palestinian universities, some like Birzeit, for 4 consecutive years, and then it closed down all 1,194 schools in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem and in Gaza. Next, Israel shut down all kindergartens until every educational institution in the occupied territory was forcibly closed. Education was criminalized in the occupied territory. This prompted Palestinians to build an illegal network of underground schools. Palestinian scholars and students are methodically denied their basic rights, including academic freedom, and are often subjected to imprisonment, denial of freedom of movement, even violent attacks on themselves or their institutions. Now we get to Israel's war on BDS, bullying, smearing, and criminalization. In response to the impressive growth of support for Palestinian rights in recent years, particularly through BDS, and evoking memories of McCarthyism in the US, Israel has since 2014 waged a global war on the BDS movement, including extensive propaganda, legal warfare, and espionage. A desperate Israeli government minister has established a tarnishing unit to smear Palestinian, Israeli, and international human rights defenders in the BDS movement, while another minister has publicly threatened me personally, with targeted civil assassination. Amnesty International has condemned these threats. While Israel is drunk with power and celebrating its relative success in passing anti-BDS legislation or resolutions in almost 30 states in the United States, it is missing the growing undercurrent of resentment and apprehension that its repressive tactics are creating. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU for instance, has condemned this unconstitutional anti-boycott legislation, saying these measures are reminiscent of McCarthy-era tactics. A University of Maryland poll in the US, published earlier this year, in fact, revealed that 72% of all Americans, almost 3/4, were against anti-BDS laws because they infringe on freedom of speech. Among those who have heard of BDS, 42% of Americans supported the statement that, quote, BDS is a legitimate, peaceful way of opposing Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. Inspired by the South African anti-apartheid movement, BDS urges action to pressure Israel to comply with international law. Opposing Israeli policy does not equal anti-Semitism. End of quote. An earlier poll in 2018, also by the University of Maryland, showed that 40% of Americans, 56% of Democrats, support imposing sanctions or tougher measures on Israel to stop its expansion and its illegal settlements in the occupied territory. Reflecting this shift in public opinion, a recent letter in Congress drafted by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and others, and endorsed by Senator Bernie Sanders, warns that Israel's formal annexation of more occupied Palestinian territory would, quote, lay the ground for Israel becoming an apartheid state, end of quote. The letter concluded with a stark threat to condition military funding of Israel on its respect for Palestinian rights under international law, an extremely rare occasion in the US Congress. In Europe, in a major blow to Israel's lawfare against BDS, the European Court of Human Rights ruled unanimously in June this year that the French highest court ruling in 2015, when it convicted BDS activists for advocating nonviolent boycotts of Israeli goods, violated Article 10, related to freedom of expression, of the European Convention on Human Rights. In effect, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that calling for a boycott of Israel to end its decades-long grave violations of Palestinian rights does not constitute incitement to discrimination, hate, or anti-Jewish bigotry. Spanish courts that have been quick to heed pressure from the Israel lobby and condemn BDS activists in most cases on fabricated grounds of discrimination or hate speech or other nonsense, should now respect the European Court of Human Rights decision and start respecting the rights of BDS activists in the Spanish state under freedom of expression. Anchored in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the BDS movement has consistently and categorically opposed all forms of racism and discrimination, as I said earlier, including anti-black racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, and anti-Semitism, among others. One's identity, the movement upholds, should never diminish or restrict one's entitlement to rights. Our movement targets complicity, not identity. Still, Israel and its lobby groups have aggressively promoted a new revisionist definition of anti-Semitism that aims, quote, to shield Israel from being held accountable to universal standards of human rights and international law, as stated by more than 40 progressive Jewish organizations worldwide in 2018. This is perhaps the latest battle in Israel's protracted war on international solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for liberation, and particularly on the BDS movement. BDS today is supported by a fast-rising number of Jewish millennials who cannot reconcile their liberal values with what Zionism and Israel stand for today. Support for BDS is also growing among prominent Jewish academics, writers, filmmakers, philosophers, feminists, and human rights defenders. Asserting that boycotting Israel is intrinsically anti-Semitic is not only baseless propaganda, it absurdly equates Israel with all Jews. This is as bigoted as claiming that boycotting a self-defined Islamic state as Saudi Arabia, say, over its legalized discrimination against women or its war crimes in Yemen would necessarily be Islamophobic. No, it's not. In May 2019, more than 240 Jewish and Israeli scholars, many of whom distinguished academics. In May 2019, more than 240 Jewish and Israeli scholars, many of whom distinguished academics specializing in anti-Semitism, Jewish history, and history of the Holocaust, issued a statement condemning a German Bundestag resolution that smears the BDS movement for Palestinian rights as anti-Semitic. Crucially, their statement accuses the German resolution of doing nothing to advance the urgent fight against anti-Semitism. One day before the above-mentioned Bundestag resolution, the German government released a study showing that 90% of all anti-Semitic and other racist attacks in Germany come from the far right. Ironically, 90% come from the voter pool of the patently anti-Semitic far-right party Alternative for Deutschland that has been at the forefront of trying to smear BDS as anti-Semitic and is this Alternative for Deutschland is one of Israel's best friends in Germany today. It is crucial to emphasize that since there's nothing Jewish about Israel's regime of occupation, siege, ethnic cleansing, and apartheid, there's nothing inherently anti-Jewish then about a non-violent, morally consistent human rights struggle to end this system of oppression. Recognizing this fact, many Jewish groups have recently lauded the BDS movement's proven commitment to fighting anti-Semitism, the real anti-Semitism, and all forms of racism and bigotry. Israel, on the other hand, has steadily forged bonds with the global far right, allying with xenophobic, racist, and indeed patently anti-Semitic forces in the US, Europe, Brazil, India, and elsewhere, thus alienating the liberal mainstream, including younger Jewish Americans and Jewish communities in Europe as well. As reported in the Israeli media last February, for instance, the Israeli government hosted the prime ministers of the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and Hungary, who, the paper said, have been accused of being anti-immigrant and anti-Semitic. Defending this Israeli partnership with anti-Semitic leaders, Likud member of parliament then, Anat Berko, said, quote, and listen to this, it's very important, quote, "They might be anti-Semites, but they are on our side." End of quote. This captures exactly what Israel is trying to do with this fraudulent anti-Semitism. As early as 1967, the prominent Jewish American writer I.F. Stone had prophetically predicted Israel's shift to the far right. He wrote, quote, "Israel is creating a kind of moral schizophrenia in world Jewry. In the outside world, the welfare of Jewry depends on the maintenance of secular, non-racial, pluralistic societies. In Israel, Jewry finds itself defending a society in which mixed marriages cannot be legalized and in which the ideal is racist and exclusionist." End of quote. Despite the massive investment in the war on BDS, Israel's anti-BDS strategy appears to be failing, as some major Israeli and Israel lobby groups have lately admitted. In a major setback for Israel's legal war on BDS, for example, since 2016, the European Union, the governments of Sweden, Ireland, and Netherlands, the Spanish Parliament, the Parliament of Switzerland, as well as leading international human rights organizations, Amnesty International, the International Federation for Human Rights, the American Civil Liberties Union, have all defended the right to boycott Israel, the right to BDS as a matter of freedom of expression. The BDS movement upholds that solidarity with the oppressed at its most fundamental level entails working to cut links of complicity with the oppressor, to do no harm. Identifying responsibility and insisting on accountability are the most crucial phases of solidarity. When Palestinians call for boycotting an institution or divesting from a multinational corporation that is implicated in Israel's violations of our human rights, we're calling for what Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. formulated in his last speech in 1968 as, quote, "withdrawing cooperation with an evil system." Withdrawing cooperation with an evil system. Doing so is hardly charitable, let alone heroic. It is a profound, profound moral obligation. At a minimum, then, true solidarity entails pressuring governments to heed Amnesty International's call and Palestinian calls for a military embargo on Israel, to support the UN and the International Court's investigation of Israeli apartheid, as well as war crimes and crimes against humanity, like every other pariah state, and to ban the products of all companies that are complicit in Israel's settlement enterprise and included in the UN list of complicit companies. It also includes student and faculty pressure on universities to end all links of complicity, especially joint military and security research with complicit Israeli universities, and cultural boycott campaigns to convince cultural institutions, writers, and artists to stop art-washing Israel's human rights violations, including by boycotting contests and festivals in Tel Aviv. It also includes campaigning in city councils, churches, universities, among others, to adopt ethical procurement and investment guidelines that exclude companies implicated in human rights violations in the Spanish state, in Africa, in Palestine, or anywhere. But why should an average person in the West today stand in solidarity with the Palestinian struggle for rights at a time when her own country may be suffering from increased unemployment, COVID-19, poverty, racism, deteriorating healthcare, education infrastructure? One answer is provided by Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa, who said, "If you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. If you are a citizen of a relatively democratic country like yours, that is complicit in Israeli war crimes against Palestinians, your neutrality amounts to accepting complicity and, in effect, siding with the oppressor. Your solidarity, then, even at the basic level of working towards cutting criminal ties of your state, as well as corporations and institutions that are based in it, becomes a moral duty. At a higher level of solidarity, beyond responsibility towards the oppressed other, the common ground of resistance to globalized oppression is thus recognized and nourished. The complicity of a Basque corporation like CAF, the train maker, for example, in building infrastructure for Israel's illegal settlement enterprise in the occupied Palestinian territory, which is a war crime under international law, triggers a compelling responsibility for citizens in the Basque country, and indeed the Spanish state at large, to act in solidarity with Palestinians beyond the call of altruistic internationalism. It's a duty. Uncovering the involvement of some of those complicit companies in the exploitation of or oppression of workers, migrants, discriminating against women, oppressing communities of color, and others in the Spanish state, say, would take this solidarity from the realm of responsibility toward the other to exploring the imperative of joint struggles against a common enemy. Solidarity thus morphs from being merely an outward act of giving into an integral component of inward-looking struggles as well. It is high time to explore the intersectionality of our contemporary globalized resistance. Divided, we fail. United, we prevail, or at least we maximize our chances to. Thank you.